Winter, 1944, Ogulthorp Camp, Georgia. Frost clung to the barbed wire, turning every strand into a silver thread against the pale sunrise. Inside the wooden compound, German women prisoners lined up for morning roll call, breath misting in the cold air. Beyond the fence, an American guard cupped his hands around a tin mug of coffee, trying to steal a little warmth before the day began. One of those prisoners was a young nurse from Hamburg. She had been captured in Italy and shipped across the Atlantic with hundreds of others. She carried herself with quiet dignity, but eyes that still betrayed exhaustion and loss. The guard, barely older than she was, came from a Kansas farm. He had never seen Europe, never heard the whistle of artillery. His war was rows of captured faces, a clipboard, and hours of silence. That morning, his gaze drifted across the compound by chance and met hers. It was only a second. No words, no smile. A soldier and his prisoner, separated by law and wire. But sometimes 1 second is enough to change the course of a lifetime. The camp was still waking. Mess hall doors slammed, boots crunched frozen mud, and from a loudspeaker came the same scratchy swing tune that played every dawn. To most, it was routine background noise. To her, it was absurd music inside captivity, warmth in a place meant for punishment. Perhaps that was what made her glance up again. The guard was still there, steam curling from his cup, watching the sun rise instead of watching the prisoners. He looked ordinary, gloves too big for his hands, collar turned against the wind. Yet something about his gentleness felt dangerous. In a world built on orders and suspicion, gentleness could get them both in trouble. Behind her, another woman whispered about the Americans, how oddly polite they were. Some laughed, thinking of the stories told back home. Enemies were supposed to be cruel, not courteous. But this camp followed its own strange rules. Prisoners worked in hospital wards and gardens instead of quarries. They traded songs through the fence with local farmhands. The war's hatred seemed to stop at the wire, leaving only confusion on both sides. When roll call ended, the nurse turned away first. The guard called his men to duty and pretended nothing unusual had happened. But all through the morning, as he checked the watchtower logs, he found himself looking toward the infirmary where she worked. They didn't know it yet, but that accidental glance would outlive the war itself. It would cross oceans, defy regulations, and remind two strangers that even in a world built on fences, the heart sometimes refuses to stay on its side of the wire. By late 1944, the war had scattered people like leaves in a storm. Across the ocean, the United States had become home to more than 400,000 captured soldiers. Most were men, but among them were a few hundred German women, former nurses, radio operators, and clerks swept up when Allied units advanced through Italy and North Africa. The government had little idea what to do with female captives, so they were placed in compounds attached to the larger camps across states like Texas, Georgia, and Louisiana. The women helped in hospitals, sewed uniforms, or tended vegetable gardens to supply the camp kitchens. Ogulthorp Camp had been built for 10,000 prisoners, but rarely held half that number. By the winter holidays, the place looked almost peaceful. Rows of wooden barracks stood beneath bare trees, the hum of a generator replacing the noise of artillery that used to fill their nights. Conditions surprised everyone, including the prisoners. The rules were strict but fair. No one was starved, no one beaten. Hot meals came 3 times a day. There were reading rooms, even a small chapel. Compared to what they had imagined about American prisons, it felt impossible. That quiet order was exactly what made the collision between the guard and the nurse stand out. He was 23, Private John Miller, a Kansas farm boy who had known more about wheat harvests than about war. When he volunteered for the Army Police, he pictured danger and heroism. Instead, he was handed a clipboard and assigned to fence duty in a sleepy camp miles from any front line. She was 25. Elizabeth Keller. Before the war, she had worked in a city hospital, dreaming of someday becoming a surgeon. Then came the air raids, the shortages, the endless propaganda. By the time she was captured, she no longer dreamed at all. In the camp infirmary, Elizabeth became useful again. American doctors valued her training, and she often translated for prisoners brought in from work details. Her English was careful, shaped by school and old radio broadcasts. That same cautious voice is what first caught John's attention one morning as he delivered supplies. "Thank you," she said, 2 words no prisoner was required to say. He answered, "You're welcome." And for a heartbeat, neither knew what to do next. From then on, he looked for reasons to be assigned to the infirmary run. Broken light bulbs, missing paperwork, any excuse that might earn him a moment at the doorway where she worked. Each meeting was quick, polite, invisible to authority, but inside that narrow space between duty and curiosity, something began to grow. The camp's rules forbade personal talk between guards and prisoners. A court-martial could end a career for less. Still, a handful of words passed safely through smiles, through simple gestures, a book left by accident on a table, a note hidden in its pages, a conversation that lasted 1 minute longer than necessary. Outside the fence, armies still fought and cities still burned. Inside, 2 ordinary people were learning the simplest truth of all that kindness, once shared, cannot be canceled by a uniform or by a flag. Days at Ogulthorp moved in slow, predictable patterns until they didn't. Every morning, the same clang of the bell, the same roll call, the same smell of weak coffee and fried oats drifting from the kitchen. And then one small detail would change. A familiar voice at the infirmary door, a smile hidden behind formality. John Miller carried the supply list so often that his friends started to joke. "Running a hospital now, Miller?" He'd shrug, pretending not to hear. It was easier than explaining that the sound of a German nurse thanking him politely in careful English had become the best part of his day. For Elizabeth, it was even stranger. She had been conditioned to respect ranks, uniforms, walls. Here the wall was a fence, yet the guard who stood beyond it seemed less like a conqueror and more like one more exhausted soul, hoping the war would end soon. He began teaching her small words, the Kansas way to say howdy, the slang soldiers used for lunch. She started correcting his pronunciation when he tried German greetings from an old phrase book. They laughed quietly, but laughter in captivity always drew attention. One afternoon, she handed him an orderly's report, fingers brushing his by accident. Neither moved. The moment held too long, then vanished as footsteps echoed in the hall. From that point, caution lived inside every breath. Regulations were clear. Any friendly contact with prisoners could mean suspension or worse. And for prisoners, even the rumor of favoritism invited punishment or transfer. So they built a language made entirely of small gestures. He'd leave a pencil sharpened and perfectly balanced at the edge of her desk, a silent good morning. She'd turn it in the opposite direction when she saw him again. "I'm safe." Outside, the war pressed on toward its bloody end. Inside the camp, victory and defeat had lost their meaning. There was only the watchtower light sweeping across cold ground, the generator hum, the smell of disinfectant, and the knowledge that someone out there was silently waiting for sunrise at the same time. At night, he sometimes patrolled the perimeter near the infirmary. She might draw the curtain back just a few inches. A single flicker of lamplight back through the glass was enough to say, "I see you." Neither dared to imagine what that feeling might become, but feelings have their own rules and ignore written ones. In a camp built to erase connection, 2 hearts had begun to improvise their own kind of truce. Not through words, not through touch, but through presence. And deep down, both knew that every step closer to kindness was also a step closer to danger. Rumors in a camp travel faster than radio. By spring 1945, guard rotations changed almost weekly, and new faces brought new gossip. Some of the men began to notice the Kansas boy who lingered too long at the infirmary door. "Careful, Miller," they said, half teasing, half warning. "You're talking more German than English these days." He shrugged it off, but the teasing hid real danger. Friendliness between guards and prisoners wasn't a story command ever wanted to read in a report. The Army preferred its lines clean watcher on one side, watched on the other. Cross that line, and both worlds could collapse. Inside the barracks, the prisoners whispered too. They had seen Elizabeth receive small kindnesses, extra blankets, a replacement lamp bulb, a packet of coffee slipped into the medical stores. Some were happy for her, others were quietly fearful. In captivity, hope can be as risky as defiance. The end of the war approached like a storm you can feel before you hear it. Newspaper clippings pinned on the mess hall wall spoke of Allied victories in Europe. Neither of them mentioned it, but each knew what that meant. Repatriation lists, ships going east, and goodbye. One afternoon in late April, the infirmary quiet, he found her sewing a tear in her sleeve. The radio in the corner played softly, an American voice announcing peace rumors. He said, "It's almost over." She nodded without looking up. Then, after a pause, she asked, "And after that, what happens to us?" He had no answer. They were interrupted by another guard entering to check supplies. Suddenly, they were strangers again. Names on separate rosters, one armed, one unarmed. After the visitor left, she slipped him a folded scrap of paper with the camp serial number and nothing else. He hid it in his pocket, heart pounding loud enough to hear in his own ears. When victory arrived for real, the camp filled with music. Bands played swing tunes, kitchen staff shouted, men cheered through fences. For the Americans, it was release. For the prisoners, uncertainty. Where victory ended for one, another journey began. Orders came within days. Women prisoners were to be processed for transport back to Europe. John volunteered for every shift near the loading area, telling no one why. He caught sight of her in the line carrying a small Red Cross parcel, head held high. Regulations forbade any farewell beyond an inspection glance, but he stepped forward anyway, pretending to check baggage tags. Their eyes met once more. He whispered quickly, "When you're free, write." She didn't answer aloud, just moved her lips so only he could read them. "Where?" he murmured. "Kansas." "You'll find me?" In seconds the line moved, the chance gone. He watched the trucks until they became dust on the road. For everyone else, the war was finally finished. For him, it had just changed shape. For her, freedom tasted strangely like loss. And between them, somewhere on that long gray highway, a promise slipped quietly into the future. Peace changed America in thousands of small ways. Men came home, cities woke, supermarkets filled again with color and plenty. In Kansas, John went back to farming. He plowed fields that looked the same as they had before the war, yet nothing about him felt the same. He often wondered if somewhere in Europe, a woman named Elizabeth was walking the ruins of her own city, looking west instead of east. 3 years passed. Then, in the spring of 1948, a letter arrived. The envelope thin but the handwriting certain. The stamps read, U.S. Occupation Zone, Germany. Inside, just one sentence in English, careful and trembling. "The wheat meets the sky in Kansas, is that still true?" He read it twice before understanding what it meant. Within months, he had written back, started the paperwork, and in the blur of bureaucracy and post-war chaos, she found her way onto a passenger manifest bound for New York. When they met again, there were no fences, no uniforms. She stepped down the gangway in a plain coat, hair tucked under a scarf, eyes searching a crowd, until she found the tall man holding a small hand-painted sign that read, "Welcome Home." Their marriage took place in a little Lutheran church on the edge of Topeka. The newspaper ran a short piece. Former prisoner marries her American guard. Some congratulated him, others whispered objections, but they ignored both praise and criticism. They had already survived something harsher than gossip. Life afterwards was simple: a rented farmhouse, a garden, quiet evenings. Sometimes she would catch him watching the sunset across the wheat fields and smile. "This really is where the wheat meets the sky," she'd say. He'd nod and answer, "Told you you'd find me." Years later, when reporters came searching for a human interest story, she would tell them, "He taught me that kindness isn't weakness, and that sometimes peace begins when you stop believing everything you were told about your enemy." They lived long enough to see the world change again, new wars, new walls, but they carried none of that bitterness. For them, the memory of that first look across frost-covered wire was enough to prove that good can survive anywhere, even in captivity. In the end, their story was more than a romance. It was a quiet reminder that fences may divide land, but not always hearts, that a single glance can outlast a war, and that somewhere between duty and mercy, two people discovered the one victory neither side had planned for love itself.